Hi, Professor Olivetti from the Economics Department. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to our first in-person lecture on inequality, discrimination, and opportunity. I have the honor of introducing our speakers today. Professor Banks is an associate professor of economics at Bucknell University. She holds a doctorate in economics from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a bachelor's degree in economics and social history from Hood College. She has been a force of change in the profession. She is the president of the National Economic Association and has been the founder and organizer of its annual Freedom and Justice Conference. She currently serves on the boards of the Economic Policy Institute and the Review of Black Political Economy. She's also the founder of the American Society of Hispanic Economists. Her work is really close to my heart. Her analysis of the economics of women's unpaid work, especially women's of color, not just in the House, but also as activists in the community, makes visible the work, the hidden work, of Black and other marginalized women and its relevance in US history. Her extensive detective work and archival research work has led her to the recovery of the economic thought of the first Black American economist, Sadie T.M. Alexander, whose speeches and writing Professor Banks collected in the book Democracy, Race, and Justice, recently published by the Yale University Press. We are extremely pleased to have Dr. Banks here with us today presenting this illuminating work. The floor is yours.
Good evening, and thank you, Professor Olivetti, for your introduction. I'd like to thank Claudia Olivetti, Andrew Levin, Andrew Samwick, the Department of Economics, and the Sadie Alexander Association for inviting me to speak about Sadie Alexander as part of the department's lecture series on inequality, discrimination, and opportunity. My research on Sadie Alexander was possible because Sadie Alexander kept very detailed, very meticulous records of her professional and personal life. And so I'd like to thank her daughters, Mrs. Mary Canaday and Dr. Ray Alexander Minter, for donating the Alexander family records to the University of Pennsylvania Archives. And of course, then I need to thank the archival staff, past and present, for organizing, preserving, and making available the Alexander family records. This extraordinary collection of historical documents provides a glimpse into a network of African American leadership, civic engagement, and strategies for achieving Black liberation over the course of much of the 20th century. Sadie Alexander was, of course, at the nexus of the documents that I analyzed. So this evening, I'm going to talk about Sadie Alexander in terms of race, historical memory, and Black liberation. Sadie Tanner Mossell was born in 1898 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, into a very accomplished family of intellectuals, artists, and activists. She received an outstanding high school education in Washington, D.C. at the all-Black, prestigious M Street High School, where she gained exposure to the thinking of leading Black intellectuals that included Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary Church Terrell, and Carter G. Woodson. It was the eminent historian Carter Woodson who had the greatest influence in shaping Sadie Alexander's thinking on the importance of preserving African American history. In 1918, Sadie Mossell began her graduate studies at the University of Pennsylvania in history, and then she switched to economics, and I have not been able to figure out why she switched. I haven't found any record to discuss why she switched and why she certainly chose economics, but she switched. Her graduate coursework was interdisciplinary and included history, sociology, and economics. She wrote her dissertation on the major demographic event that was shaping the nation, the movement of African Americans from the South into the North in response to the World War I increased demand for black labor in the manufacturing sector. And that was really the first time in our history when there was a sustained increased demand for black labor in the North. This was also the beginning of the Great Migration. For her dissertation, Massell conducted field research by going into the homes of 100 black families who lived in the 29th Ward and interviewed them about obstacles that they encountered in trying to make a living in Philadelphia after they migrated from the South. The question that she studied was the degree to which migrants were able to earn what she called a fair standard of living and what we would refer to as a living wage. The degree to which they could earn a fair standard of living that would enable them to adjust to life in Philadelphia. After extensive record gathering and research, she found that the majority of migrants, in fact, could earn a fair standard of living and adjust to life in Philadelphia. That was actually a really important question because the migrants in Philadelphia, as well as in cities in other areas of the North, faced a great deal of hostility from longtime residents because of the assumption that migrants were going to be an economic drain on the city, that migrants were going to breed diseases, spread epidemic diseases, and that migrants were troublesome and prone to engaging in criminal behavior. Indeed, Massell's doctoral studies took place during a period of intense anti-black racial violence and terror that included the Red Summer of 1919, where white mobs attacked and murdered African Americans, not only in the South, but also in cities in the North, especially where migrants had relocated. The Tulsa Massacre of 1921 took place just 2 weeks before she graduated. And racial violence left a deep imprint on her thinking. It ended up being a topic that she mentioned in later decades. As an economics graduate student, Massell benefited from having very supportive economics professors who understood the significance of having her in the program and the need for her to have funding in order to conduct her field research and in order to publish it. When she graduated in June 15th of 1921, Professor Raymond Bai lent her his doctoral hood to wear for this momentous occasion, and this was a hood that his mother had made. Massell's department chair, Ernest Minor Patterson, used his influence to no avail in order to help Massell find a job. Massell's inability to find a position as an economist said more about the barriers that black women faced because of the interaction of gender and race than it did about the economics profession. And I say that because none of the three African American women who in 1921 received the doctorate degree for the first time in our history were able to get employment from either a white institution or a black institution that was commensurate with their level of education. It would be nearly a decade before that occurred, and it occurred in 1929 when Howard University hired Eva Dykes into a professorship in English and then hired Georgiana Simpson in 1931 into a professorship in German. And Eva Dykes and Georgiana Simpson were the two other African American women who received their doctorates in 1921. All right, so 1927, first African American woman is able to get a job with a doctorate degree as a professor. But by then, Massell had married Raymond Pace Alexander after he finished law school at Harvard And she had already graduated from the University of Pennsylvania Law School, so she switched into law in 1927 is when she finished. Sadie Massel, and hereafter I'm going to refer to her by her married name, Alexander, went on to have an important and distinguished career as an attorney, working to achieve, often with her husband, African American rights of citizenship. 2 years before she died in 1989 in Philadelphia, the Alexander family donated her records to the archives at the University of Pennsylvania. Although legal scholars and historians have researched Sadie Alexander's life as a legal professional and a civil rights activist, she was a mere footnote, and I mean that not just figuratively, but also literally. She was a mere footnote in economic analysis until 1991, when economist Julianne Malveaux published her research on Sadie Alexander in the American Economic Review. Malveaux's article focused on Sadie Alexander's dissertation, and it explored the loss to the nation as well as to the economics profession from not having Sadie Alexander's economic thought as part of the discipline because of the gender and racial discrimination that had prevented her from gaining employment as an economist. Julianne Malveaux recently stated that, quote, "History belongs to she who holds the pen. All too often, our histories are swallowed because it does not serve some people to know the whole truth," end of quote. So an African-American woman economist brought Sadie Alexander to the scholarly attention of the economics profession, and she had been encouraged to do so by her advisor, Phyllis Wallace, also African-American, and this was an act of restoring historical memory. Over a decade later, having read Sadie Alexander's 1930 Opportunity magazine was the magazine of the National Urban League. After I read the 1930 Opportunity magazine article, Negro Women in Our Economic Life, and Julianne Malveaux's article on the missed opportunity to the economics profession, I really felt compelled to go to the University of Pennsylvania archives in order to see if I could find something that suggested that Sadie Alexander had continued to have, some engagement with economic issues. The general thinking at the time when I started my research in 2003, a long time ago, was that Sadie Alexander had given up her interest in economics after she became a lawyer. And what's also interesting about this research process for me is that I had recently, 1999, finished my dissertation, which also involved extensive archival research, which at that time certainly was very unusual in the United States in economics, and that I had also done archival research on African American migrants in the early migration period to a city in Pennsylvania. So to me it seemed like a natural fit, especially since I had the skills to do this archival research. When I started researching the archives, I found that Sadie Alexander had left behind a large number of speeches. And as I read the speeches, what I realized is that most of the speeches were not about legal issues, and certainly some of them were, but that nearly all of the speeches focused on the economic status of African Americans. The deeper I dug through the extensive archival collection, and there are over 81, you see this is a picture of the archives at Penn, so you can get a sense of the dimension of the boxes. As I dug through this extensive archival collection of over 81 boxes, I was really shocked and delighted to discover that Sadie Alexander had actually spent her lifetime focused on economic conditions affecting African Americans. And so the speeches attest to that as well as to her brilliance, and she was brilliant. She finished her doctorate, by the way, when she was just 23 years old. The discrimination that Sadie Alexander experienced as a black woman could not take away her knowledge of economics, and so she continued to use this knowledge and reasoning to challenge unfair economic and political policies and practices that were discriminatory and oppressive towards African Americans. And I think that if I had not gone to the archives in 2003 to do this research, that today we would still think that George Edmund Haynes was our first African American economist. I also discovered by reading through boxes and boxes and boxes of old correspondence that Sadie Alexander had in fact always thought of herself as an economist. She stated that explicitly in a letter from 1944. And she had also continued through various actions to function as an economist, even while having a very demanding career as an attorney. Sadie Alexander was an economist in the public realm, and yet her life as an economist was forgotten and even overlooked. I believe this happened in part because she did not publish articles in economic journals. Unlike other economists who published in academic journals, I found that Sadie Alexander's economic thought was contained primarily within speeches that she gave to non-academic audiences. But the omission of Sadie Alexander's ideas from our historical memory is also a reflection of the time during which she lived, when white Americans often overlooked or dismissed the critical thought of African American scholars and intellectuals, most of whom operated in racially segregated institutions because of white exclusion. Racial segregation, therefore, undermined Sadie Alexander's life, as well as the collective memory of her life. So it ended up becoming my mission to recover Sadie Alexander's economic thought and restore it to the economics discipline in order to right the historic wrong of her exclusion from the discipline. The importance of historical memory was not lost on Sadie Alexander. Indeed, historical memory was a theme that ran through most of her speeches. The early speeches, for example, focused on the significant contributions of Africans and their African American descendants to the economic, political, and cultural development of the United States. Alexander noted the omission of Black American contributions from our history books, and that the nation's educational system encouraged white Americans to think of themselves as superior and encouraged all groups, including African Americans, to think of Black Americans as inferior. About our nation's history, Alexander stated, quote, "The histories you study, prepared by white men whose purpose is to impress on your minds the superiority of their race, have either omitted or mentioned briefly and without comment regarding their true import," end of quote. So Sadie Alexander provided a counter history of African Americans that defied prevailing beliefs that Black people were racially inferior by documenting African American economic, political, and cultural contributions to the nation. In the 1920s, she spoke of cultural contributions in literature and music, saying, quote, The Negro has contributed, as is now established, the only American music. The spirituals, which we once were ashamed of, thank God we have come ourselves to appreciate and to realize are a unique contribution to American art. The jazz music of today, which has taken not only America, but Europe, is the product of Negro genius. Jazz, it represents in every detail the blare, the rush, the discord of modern America. Our music is destined to place us with the great, gifted races of the world, end of quote. She further described Black Americans as a people whose significant economic and cultural contributions to the nation were made under extreme forms of oppression and whose challenges to racial inequities made them the actual bearers of American democracy, saying, quote, "The American Negroes are not beggars for privileges, but rather we are leaven in the bread of the American way of life, prickers of the conscience of the people, sentinels of justice," end of quote. With respect to economic contributions, and her speeches are filled with various examples of contributions that African Americans have made to the economy. But Sadie Alexander stated in 1936, quote, "The Negro has undoubtedly contributed more labor in proportion to his numbers to American civilization than any other of the many racial groups that constitute this heterogeneous population," end of quote. African Americans' greatest accomplishment, she said, however, was their ability to survive in a hostile land through 300 years of racial tyranny. The speeches that Sadie Alexander delivered, primarily to Black audiences, left not only a record of her intellectual thought, but also a social history of African Americans through major periods of the 20th century. As such, Sadie Alexander occupies a unique position in our history of economics, not just as the first African American economist, but also as the only African American economist who both lived through and chronicled the political economic changes and challenges that affected African Americans' economic status through major periods of the 20th century. The World War I and Great Migration era, the Great Depression, World War II and post-war era, and the Civil Rights era of racial unrest. What did not change over this long period for African Americans, however, was the persistence of racial inequities and deprivations. Because of the persistence of racial discrimination against African Americans, by the 1940s, Sadie Alexander began to advocate for government policies that would especially benefit African Americans and lessen harm done to them. The policies that she called for would provide significant improvements in the economic position of Black Americans today, while also benefiting workers more generally. Alexander advocated for the right to work, and that meant that anybody who wanted a job and was willing and able to work for a job could get a job. She advocated for the right to work as a right of citizenship, and she believed that full employment was the only solution to the economic subjugation of African American workers. Alexander viewed the right to work at jobs that paid living wages as an economic right that was essential for enabling people to enjoy democratic rights. As such, she called for an equitable distribution of national income, for full employment job guarantees, and public works programs, not simply in the traditional sense of building roads and bridges, but public works programs that addressed urgent social needs tied to poverty and deprivation. These are the kinds of public works programs that we are really starting to talk about and think about today as a nation. Sadie Alexander believed that economic security was necessary not only to improve human welfare, but also as a foundation for the maintenance of democratic institutions. By the late 1930s, she began to express her fears that a self-proclaimed Messiah could manipulate the fears and economic insecurities of white Americans through racial demagoguery such that they would be willing to put a fascist in office who would undermine the rule of law. Given that, she believed that government had a responsibility to lessen income inequality and uncertainty in order to safeguard democratic institutions. In other words, she wanted economic reforms that would lessen the likelihood that white Americans would resort to racial violence and scapegoating of Black Americans and other racialized groups. For over a 50-year period, from the 1920s to the 1970s, Sadie Alexander's economic thought covered topics that later generations of Black American economists have since addressed, such as the importance of union representation, the importance of wealth, the need for cooperative endeavors, and the need for race-conscious policies. The need for race-conscious policies developed out of her observations of New Deal programs. In the 1930s, Alexander gave several speeches to Black audiences where she stated that this was really the first time since Reconstruction where there was even a possibility that the federal government might positively influence the condition of Black Americans. She said that the economic concerns of Black workers needed to be persistently brought to the attention of public officials, or their needs would be overlooked, and Black workers would end up in a worse relative position than prior to the Great Depression. By the mid-1930s, when Sadie Alexander examined the effects of New Deal policies, she realized that New Deal policies were not set up to provide relief, reform, and recovery in an equitable manner for Black workers. In fact, Southern whites in Congress wanted to preserve white dominance over Black labor in the South by preventing them from receiving New Deal benefits and protections. Southern whites in Congress were able to do this by writing legislation that excluded the job categories where the majority of Black workers disproportionately worked, and that's in the agricultural sector and domestic service, by excluding those categories from receiving benefits, and also by administering New Deal policies at the local level where they would have control without federal oversight. The language of New Deal legislation was racially neutral, but it had a disparate impact on African Americans. And so that provided Sadie Alexander with a really important lesson, and the lesson was the need to have race-conscious policies that would benefit African Americans. Moreover, she advocated for race-conscious policies that were compensatory, that made restitution for a history of racial discrimination and exclusion. In 1963, during the Civil Rights Movement, Alexander was chair of the Philadelphia Commission on Human Relations. She gave an address at the Commission's annual conference that drew on her expertise as both a lawyer and an economist. In the address, she called for compensatory opportunities for African Americans in jobs, education, and housing in order to remedy past injustices. With respect to jobs, Alexander knew that Black workers faced labor market discrimination. This was obvious to her based on her knowledge and based on her observations of Black employment, and not an economic question that needed to be proven over and over and over again. Instead, she knew that the default, the norm in employment in the United States was discrimination based on race. Under Sadie Alexander's leadership, the Human Rights Commission regarded racial discrimination in access to good jobs as the standard practice by stating, quote, the absence of affirmative action constitutes an act of discrimination, the absence of affirmative action constitutes an act of discrimination. And notably, that was 2 years before President Johnson even issued his executive order on affirmative action. Sadie Alexander, like so many Black economists who have followed her, understood that the economic status of African Americans developed out of a long history of systemic, structural racial oppression. In 1963, when discussing Black protest against racial injustice, Alexander stated, quote, "It was born with slavery and has been nurtured by degradation, discrimination, and segregation until it has become the greatest single moral issue of the 20th century," end of quote. It is an appalling commentary on our nation that Sadie Alexander's speeches are as relevant today as when she gave them. Last year's uprising against systemic racial injustice bears witness to their ongoing relevance in housing discrimination and residential segregation, in racial disparities in our educational system, in African Americans' high rates of joblessness or concentration in jobs that lack benefits, in the whitewashing of our nation's history of racial oppression, and the continued claims that African Americans are intellectually and culturally inferior. The speeches are also relevant in matters of policing and voter suppression. In 1942, for example, she gave a speech titled "On the Status of the Philadelphia Negro," which was a powerful condemnation of the suppression of African American rights. The speech enumerated the ways in which the legal system and customary practices that had taken on the strength of the law have failed to provide equal rights and protections for African Americans through everyday occurrences, or what we would refer to today simply as living while Black. She talked about 2 cases that violated the Fourth Amendment guarantee of security of the home from search and seizure as examples of Black homes being subjected to unwarranted search and seizure. Alexander described one of the events as follows, quote, "To those of us who talk with and live among the Negro masses, it is not unfamiliar to hear the expression, 'the law came in.' By this they mean that an officer clothed with the authority of the law knocked on their door, entered when it was open, or knocked it down if it was not opened. I distinctly recall the case of Samuel Shelton, a respectable colored man who owned his own home, where he lived comfortably with his wife. One evening, about 3 years ago, officers without a warrant broke the beautiful plate glass of his front door, rushed into the house, and began to search for an escaped criminal whom they had heard was hiding in his house. Mr. Shelton was taking his bath. He had locked the door. When the officers knocked, he refused to open the door as he was in no condition to receive an invited or uninvited guest, and he was too excited to know what to do. Within a few seconds, the bathroom door was broken down. The officers ordered him to put on his clothes, dragged him into their waiting car, and put him under arrest. After being put to the expense of employing counsel and the humiliation of an arrest, not to mention the mental and physical anguish and pain suffered by Mr. and Mrs. Shelton, Mr. Shelton was discharged. The officers who made the arrest without a warrant were not even reproved, but only ordered to replace the plate glass in the front door and the bathroom door, end of quote. Although Sadie Alexander discussed cases of infringement on Black freedoms that took place in 1941, 80 years ago, the speech provides powerful documentation of the continuity of criminal justice abuses against African Americans through over-policing, unlawful entry, and coerced confessions. These abuses call to mind recent cases involving the police violation of the Fourth Amendment in the killing of Ms. Breonna Taylor and the coerced confessions of the young boys in the Central Park 5 case. Linking policing to politics, Sadie Alexander went on to express the view in the same speech that the indiscriminate rounding up and harassment of Black people under the pretext of a crime having been committed or about to be committed goes in concert with attempts to suppress Black political agency, saying, quote, "Equally reprehensible is our failure to protect the Negro masses from the deprivation of their liberty without due process of law. Who in Philadelphia does not hang his head in shame when he recalls the mass arrest in 1941 in northern Philadelphia of over 200 Negroes without warrants or probable cause, who were held in jail for 24 to 48 hours? Every colored person in this neighborhood, on the streets, in a store, about to enter his home, was arrested on the basis that, because of frequent pocketbook snatching, attacks, and assaults, it was necessary to round up every colored man or woman on these streets. Coincidentally, if not particularly significant, is the fact that a political campaign had just closed in which the people of this neighborhood had dared assert their political freedom." End of quote. Sadie Alexander's description of policing as a form of Black community harassment designed to suppress Black political participation provides a connection to an earlier historical period when white mobs used violence in the late 19th century to prevent African Americans from voting, to more recent policies such as broken windows and stop and frisk. Alexander's discussion of policing reveals that these recent practices are not just forms of harassment, but are also means to suppress Black political participation. In conclusion, although Sadie Alexander was a public intellectual, her economic thought and life as an economist was overlooked because of racial segregation and because she disseminated her ideas through speeches rather than through publications. Last year, African American economist Patrick Mason shared a story with me about another African American economist, the late Rhonda Williams. They had talked about the difficulty African American economists have in publishing, and this is what Patrick said, quote, "Rhonda explained something important. She said, we have to publish to leave footprints. We have to publish so that others will have something to build on." So for Rhonda, research and journal publications weren't a selfish careerist activity. It was her contribution to the struggle. We are all part of a collective enterprise, end of quote. On June 15th of this year, I published a book with Sadie Alexander as the author of her economic speeches, and I published it 100 years to the day, and I think even to the hour, of when she received her doctorate degree. Her footprints are finally visible, and now she can be recognized for her part in our collective struggle. The history of economics, as seen through the eyes of our first African American economist, places racial oppression at the center of economic and political life, economic analysis and political life. And it is my hope for those of you who are aspiring economists that, like Sadie Alexander, you will not be daunted by personal setbacks, whatever they may be, that you will follow her footprints, build on them, and continue the struggle for Black liberation and racial justice more broadly. Thank you.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Perfect. Hi, I'm Laura Francisco. I'm a current senior here at Dartmouth College. Before I say anything else, I would really like to say thank you, Professor Banks, for giving us such a wonderful and insightful lecture. It was truly extravagant, and thank you for all the work that you've done to bring out what Sadie Alexander did and couldn't bring to light during her time. It's really much appreciated. Also, thank you to the economics department for putting all of this together. It's really, really awesome, so thank you. So this past year, alongside 3 other Dartmouth seniors, we started the Sadie Alexander Association, which is a group that strives to create a community for underrepresented groups on Dartmouth's campus who are pursuing or thinking of pursuing the economics major or minor. One thing that we noted when coming up with this organization was there are not a lot of minority students in the econ department because it is a very scary field to go in and there's not a lot of representation. So what we wanted to do was make that space on this campus so people could come together, find other people who are like them, who have similar struggles, whether that be academic, racial, like gender bias, etc. And we wanted to give them a place where we could talk, find mentorship, whether that be formal or informal, with the professor, with upperclassmen, and then also advocate for change. And when coming up with the name for this association, Sadie Alexander was the perfect match for everything that we wanted to do. I mean, look at her. She was a trailblazer within this field. She was the very first African-American woman, African-American, to get a PhD in economics. And that's what we wanted to kind of go for. Like, we are also the first in what we're doing. And especially at Dartmouth, we are the first organization for Black minority students to have a place. And we hope to kind of aspire as much change that Sadie Alexander had done and bring to light her name and her vision. So thank you very much to everybody who has been a part of our journey as an organization. Thank you to our advisors who are absolutely wonderful, and thank you to the econ department for all the support that you have given us. So with that being said, with that being said, oh my goodness. With that being said, I think we're gonna start off with a couple of questions. I actually had one that I would like to ask. But now that you, Professor Banks, have published this book, Democracy, Race, and Justice, first I would like to say it's really awesome that you gave her the authorship of her work. Incredible. Do you think that now that we have the opportunity to read what she was getting across about, the economics for Black people within America, do you think it's going to be we're going to have change, or her writing and ideas will change the way that the economy here operates?
Thanks, Laura, for the question. I don't think that that reading Sadie Alexander's speeches will lead to a change in the economy, but my hope is that it will lead to a change in what we teach in economic classes and the approach that we often take in economic classes. That's my hope, and so. And one of the final things that I said in talking about Sadie Alexander is that for her, racial oppression was really central to the way in which the economy operates. And so I think that that is something that economists need to think about and to embrace if certainly we are really serious about being a profession that is more inclusive. Then we have to move away from doing economics the way that, that it was done in the past by the, marginal school, for example, and return to a more institutional approach, which is what Sadie Alexander, that was the school of thought that she was a part of. So, the other part I would say, and I had this conversation with the man who drove me here from the airport, when I talked to him about my research, he wanted to know, what I thought about, the status of black people over the next 50 years. And I said, I don't know what's going to happen to black people over the next 50 years, but that I have noticed a change in the thinking of very young people who are probably about 24 years and younger, your generation, are much more enlightened and get things in a way that previous generations have not. So for that, I'm hopeful.
Thank you. We're opening the audience up for questions. Professor Levin, will you turn the
Well, I just want to start by just repeating what Laura said. We're so lucky and so thankful to have you here. I mean, we're inspired by Sadie Alexander, but actually just hearing your story and seeing your photograph of the archives, and the fact that you were also a pioneer in pursuing research that wasn't always given a lot of credit in economics, and carrying that on long enough that now it's starting to make a real dent. And I remember earlier this year when you gave a public presentation to the whole American Economic Association, and lots of people all over the world saw it live, and others see it, now posted on the web. So my two questions are, first, could you tell us a little bit more about the National Economic Association, because Professor Olivetti mentioned it, and your leadership of that. Not everyone here in this room may be familiar with it. And the other question was, when you talk about African American black music and how Sadie Alexander kind of highlighted that, and you talked about the police, you talked about issues, wide range. Like, what I think of that's kind of pushing the boundaries of economics, maybe breaking down the walls so that the distinctions that we've traditionally made, sociology's over here, anthropology's over there, this is political science and government, because you talked about kind of the political space and the political roles. And economics is over here in its own corner, and it seemed like Sadie Alexander was breaking down those walls too, and I'm just curious if you think that's a direction that we need to go further with.
Thank you. Thanks, Andy. Great question, Professor Levin. And I jotted notes, but I have really sloppy handwriting, so I hope I can read what I wrote. The National Economics Association started in 1969 as the Caucus of Black Economists. They started out of protest, protest over the marginalization of black economists. And so when they formed, they wanted the American Economics Association to take issues of race and racism seriously. And so they thought that the best way to do this would be to form an organization. And I'm really proud that this year I'm the president of the NEA, and I did so because I wanted to also honor Sadie Alexander. So I took over the helm on the 100-year anniversary of when Sadie Alexander received her doctorate degree, so that I could talk about her, as well as the amazing work of African American economists over this past century. But some of the important programs, one would be the AEA summer program. So there are programs that we have in our profession that are under the auspices of the American Economics Association, but they were actually started by NEA members. And so the summer program is one of those. SIMGAP, Committee on the Status of Minority Groups in the Economic Profession, is another. So a really important group, promotes African American and Black American economists, advocates for us. We publish the Review of Black Political Economy. Okay, and so then your other question was about economics. It goes back to an earlier tradition, which is a political economy and an institutionalist approach to economics. So Sadie Alexander is within that tradition. And so for me, as a heterodox economist, And again, one of the reasons why it was so opportune that I went to the archives with a background not only in archival research, but also as a heterodox economist, is that when I read all of what she was writing about, I knew that it was economics, because in the heterodox world, we look at systemic problems and structural factors and the way in which belief systems, ideology reinforce those structures of oppression. So I think that economics would benefit as a discipline in embracing other schools of thought. We are much too narrow. And I think the lack of diversity is a reflection of the fact that we are very, very narrow, and we alienate a lot of people who tend to think about structural and systemic issues and ideology.
Do we have more questions? Raise your hand. Yes, no? We have a question.
Hi, I first of all just like to thank you again, especially for putting all the writings together. I really look forward to that read. I guess my name's Joanna, hi. And my question is, so I understand that Alexander was not able to publish in journals and probably speak to academic audiences, especially as they were probably all white. Do you think that the reason that she did speeches at all instead of just writings was to be able to pass that knowledge down in any kind of form?
Thanks, Joanna, for your question. She spoke to white audiences as well as black audiences. And so in 1947, she served on President Truman's Committee on Civil Rights, a really important committee. And they issued a report called To Secure These Rights, which advocated for an improvement in the enforcement of civil rights in the United States. And so after she participated on that committee, she had more speaking engagements that, that reached wider audiences, including more white Americans. I don't think that she was thinking, I'm going to give speeches because I'm not publishing. She published an article in a law, she published a legal article, I think, for the National Bar Association. She was giving speeches simply because she was very much in demand as a speaker. She was very charismatic. And she was a novelty early on because she was a black woman with a doctorate degree. And she was super smart. So she was giving speeches for those reasons and not as an alternative to publishing. She really wasn't, as a lawyer, and she wasn't a law professor, she was a practicing attorney. So publishing really wasn't something that she would have done. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, I had an additional question. So earlier, like at the start of your lecture, you mentioned that Sadie Alexander could not find a job in economics after receiving her PhD. And I was curious to see if black males were able to find a job, or if it was just solely on the fact that they were black African American, or if it was being a woman.
Yes, black men with doctorates were able to get jobs at HBCUs, right? And the first black man who received a doctorate in economics was Abram Harris Jr., and that was 1930, and he was also able to get a job as a professor.
Do you know when the first woman was able to get a job in the field of economics? Black women?
I don't. It's a really good question. You need to look into that. That's a really good question, because I think the next black woman who got a doctorate degree in economics, that was in the mid-1940s. And I don't know when Phyllis Wallace and people of that generation, I don't, you know, who was the third, I don't know. So that's a great question that you should look into.
Okay.
It does. It absolutely does. You know, because this is a history that needs to be excavated, recovered.
I was wondering, hi, my name is Chara Lyons, I'm 23, and I was wondering, what do you believe to be, if you know, the most challenging aspects in the 21st century for Black women entering into economics in today's day and age? Besides, you know, the general like racism and discrimination, major challenges.
I don't think that the challenge is entering into economics. I think that if you're interested in getting a doctorate in economics, that you can get a doctorate in economics. I think that there's a program for everybody who's interested in getting a doctorate degree in economics. I don't think that that is a challenge. I think the challenge is getting Black women, right, interested in economics and continuing to progress, right? So getting Black women into principles of econ classes, and then continuing to advance into upper level econ courses. That is a challenge. And I think that that's a challenge because the material often doesn't resonate with what they know to be true in terms of their lived experiences and their interest. It's a complicated issue because I think that the key is what happens at the undergraduate level. That's where we lose a lot of students. It's not the math. It's not the math because we know that there are more Black women in mathematics and STEM than there are in economics. So there's something distinctive about economics that ends up, you know, I think, I don't know what word I'm looking for, but there's something about economics that kind of puts off a lot of Black and brown young people. And so that's the problem. And so getting them in upper level courses, making sure that they've taken sufficient math classes so that they can then go into a graduate program. And when they apply, I mean, they're likely to get accepted somewhere. And the key then is to go to a school that is the best fit. I think that there's a notion out there that people should only go to a top 10 or a top 15, 20 school. And that's not the case. You should really go to some place where you think you will be happy and be able to do research with a professor or professors who are doing the kind of research that you want to do. We have our work cut out for us as a profession because we really have to rethink the way that we do the principles of econ class.
If you have any questions, just raise your hand. We have a mic coming. Okay. If not, I
There's a question right over there.
Fabulous.
Hello, my name is Najma. I'm a 24, so I'm a sophomore. And I know that it's kind of dangerous to play the like what if game about like Sadie Alexander and like her like, and like, you know, what if she like, you know, was like was admitted as a professor to these institutions. But I'm gonna ask that question. What do you think like of the economic like principles that she was talking about and that she was thinking in this wholly like different way? What do you think would have been the most, I guess, revolutionary in like the way that we like think of economics today? Yeah.
So the question is, if Sadie Alexander had been a professor, how would she have taught a principles of econ class? Is that the question?
Not just the principles of econ class, but which like idea that she was, I guess, propagating during that time. Which one do you think would have been like the most influential in like?
Yeah, you know, I'm going to go back to what you said about the difficulty of doing a what if. But the reason why it's really difficult is because Sadie Alexander was giving speeches at the request of different groups. Dr. Alexander, Attorney Alexander, can you talk to us today about the role of women in the economy? Can you talk to us about the contributions of African American or colored people, for example? But her training was very different, right? She was an institutionalist, but I would situate her work within the context of economic history and maybe even macroeconomics. So had she been a professor, she would have taught courses and conducted research, probably that was tied to some of the issues that she embraced in her dissertation. And this is the point that Julianne Malveaux made. If you haven't read Missed Opportunity, take a look at it. It is a very short, brilliant analysis of Sadie Alexander's dissertation research, the different topics that she examined, and then possibilities for research, where we would have gone. One of the things that Malveaux speculates is that The State of Working America is a publication that the National Urban League started in, I don't know when, the 1970s perhaps. And so she thinks that it's possible that Sadie Alexander would have published something like the State of State of Black America at an earlier period. So it's a tough question because her speeches are really informed by lots of different things. And I think that it would be very different from what she would have taught as a professor, which would have been more in line with her research interest.
I have another question. Now that we have information about Sadie Alexander and her, economic thought, what she kind of figured out, how can we implement this now into teaching econ to incoming students?
I think that and I haven't thought about this carefully because it's been a while since I've taught a principles of econ class, but the approach that we use at Bucknell is we have a one-semester principles class. I don't know if do you have a combined? And so in that, there's a little bit of exposure. There's some exposure to micro and macro, and there is history of thought, and there's economic history. And so what I would do differently in terms of Sadie Alexander is I would probably spend on the history of thought. I would include her, and I would connect it to events that took place in the 20th century, and probably in terms of the New Deal. So I would minimize the amount of time that I spent on Smith and Marx and Keynes. They would still be in there, but I would give more exposure to Sadie Alexander. She was here. She was talking about the United States. So that's one of the things that I would do differently. And as I said, her speeches tell us her intellectual thought, but she chronicles the African American experience along the way. Some of her speeches draw on a history, but the other speeches, which were contemporary, she was talking about events that were taking place at the time. They are now history from our standpoint. So they're a really rich source of information on African Americans at various points in the 20th century. You could talk about them in terms of not just the New Deal policies, but also talk about it in the context of the civil rights movement and racial unrest that took place. She talked a little bit about, just a little bit, in the 70s about deindustrialization. She didn't use that language, but she was talking about it. I mean, there's a great migration. There's just a wealth of information about events that took place in the United States, the Great Migration changed our country in very significant ways in terms of shifting the African American population into an urban population, increasingly northern. We talked about the music, right? So there's a cultural impact, political, social. There's just a lot to address by focusing on the things that Sadie Alexander talked about.
Thank you.
So, sorry, unfortunately, this is the end of the official program. Thank you so much for giving this talk and for answering the question. This has been, I was so enthralled and into your talk and what you were saying that I forgot that I was supposed to keep time. So actually, we were supposed to finish the official program at 6. So this is a testament to how much interest there is in your work and in what you said. You're saying that we're all still here. Nobody moved. I've never seen anything like this, I think. So thank you again for coming to Dartmouth. And for those of you who want to stay, and if you agree, we can still take a few more questions. But if you have to leave, please feel free to go. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.